Okay, so what we have is a Thursday, the 19th of January, 2017. Welcome to part 2 of Israel, a playlist by somebody named Cohen. This is part 2. Welcome to the One State Solution Show, where we present the facts about the Middle East, about history of the Middle East, and we allow you to make up your own minds and to perhaps even change your paradigm shift as to Okay, so what we have is a... Alright, so it looks like we're good to go. I suppose I should say hi. What we're going to do, what I'm going to do right now is carry on with the playlist that I was presenting to you. The next one that I'm going to bring to you is, again, with Caroline Glick. It's, I think, in the form of an interview or a fairly long show. It's over an hour, maybe over an hour and a half. I can't remember. But interesting as all heck. I'm telling you, it's an eye-opener to see the way the what do you call it, United Nations mainstream media has been keeping the actual facts away from the world population. Now, the world population can obviously go and look up for themselves and do their own little, due diligence and try and figure out what the facts are. However, most people don't do that. They just believe what they are told. But here we have a case where we will be able to show you that what you've been told, what you believe, is not necessarily the facts. All right. I guess there's really no other. There's one thing I do want to say is there's a chat window on the YouTube page. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, criticisms, whatever, please put them down in that chat window. Also, at the end of the section, as usual, I invite anybody into a hangout that we can chat about, where we could chat about what we've just been watching, what we just learned. All right, then. I see no reason to wait for anything, so why don't we just get right into it, huh? Just give me 1 minute and we'll get right into it.
An honor to be introduced by Frank Gaffney and to introduce Caroline Glick. She is the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post and director of the Israel Security Project at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. She serves as adjunct senior fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy here in D.C. She is the author of Shackled Warrior, Israel and the Global Jihad, put out in 2008. She holds a BA in political science from Columbia University and a master's in public policy from Harvard University. She served as assistant foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from 1997 to 98. She regularly briefs senior administration officials and members of Congress, such as myself, on issues of joint Israel-American concern. And to introduce Caroline, she lives in Jerusalem. She made Aliyah in 1991. She has 2 sons. A former officer in the Israel Defense Forces, she was a core member of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians. I'll bet that was a learning experience. experience.
Indeed.
And later served as an assistant policy advisor to the Prime Minister. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, the widely published Caroline Glick was an embedded journalist with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division. And I'll bet that was a learning experience as well. She was awarded a Distinguished Civilian Service Award from the U.S. Secretary of the Army for her battlefield reporting. And most recently, she has authored a new book, The Israel Solution, a One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East, put out this year. Help me welcome Caroline Glick.
I think I'll stand over there.
I'm sorry. If I can read one blurb in praise of her book so that you'll know how good it is. And this is by our friend that we all know and respect, John Bolton. He says, with skill and boldness, Caroline Glick cuts through the fog of diplomacy surrounding what Israel should do with the West Bank. Her analysis and strategy will cause headaches and palpitations in foreign ministries around the world, wedded to the failed 2-state solution. It will be a character-building experience for them. Okay, with that, let's welcome Caroline Glick.
Thank you so much, Congressman Lamborn. Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you all for coming this morning. I know it's a Friday in Washington. It's very tempting to, go to the Eastern Shore. So I appreciate everybody here. We meet right now, Friday morning in Washington, D.C., at the same time that the Israeli Security Cabinet is meeting in Tel Aviv, actually, in an emergency session to try to figure out how to respond to what the next steps forward are going to be in the war that Hamas is waging against Israel, and how to respond to a ceasefire offer that is on the table, that it was put there by John Kerry, Secretary of State of the United States of America. And right now we find ourselves really at a shocking juncture because, the Obama administration has recognized a Palestinian Authority government that is led by Hamas, a recognized foreign terrorist organization by the United States State Department in conjunction with Fatah, another Palestinian terrorist organization that for political reasons the United States insists is not a terrorist organization. The ceasefire proposal on the table right now that again, the Israeli Security Cabinet is debating now, as I stand here before you, is essentially the same ceasefire proposal that was put forward by Hamas, but it's now an American proposal. Hamas was talking about a temporary ceasefire for 5 days under the quote unquote, as a humanitarian ceasefire, while the party's representatives would be meeting in Cairo to discuss Hamas's other demands of Israel. And the Obama administration's proposal on the table right now for Israel is a 7-day humanitarian ceasefire to begin tomorrow morning. And what these ceasefires are opportunities for Hamas to regroup, to retrench, now to stop Israel's assault while Hamas is in distress because of the progress that IDF forces have been making at great human cost to them and to Israel since last Thursday when the ground invasion began. In addition, the United States, when Secretary of State John Kerry came to the region last week, he had announced that on Monday of this week, the United States had already transferred $47 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, what does it mean to Gaza? It means that they just transferred $47 million to Hamas in the middle of the war. And what did they do at the same time? The next day, while John Kerry was in the region in Cairo, the FAA announced that it was shutting down all American airline flights to Tel Aviv International Airport. Now, what does that mean? Why did they do that? They said because of concerns about aircraft safety. Because Hamas had set off a missile to around the Ben Gurion airport that was shot down by Iron Dome, the Israeli missile defense battery, and fell about a mile away from Ben Gurion. And they said that this was for airline safety, but when we see, it was transparently not so, because the United States has not shut down U.S. airline traffic to Pakistan, where civilian aircraft have already been shot down in Karachi, most recently last month. They have not shut down. They have not closed down. They have not put a ban on U.S. airline transit to Syria, to Yemen, to Afghanistan, or even to Ukraine, right, where they claim that this was because of increased concern after Ukrainian pro-Russian opposition forces shot down the civilian aircraft over Ukraine last week. However, they still haven't shut down American airlines from going to Ukraine, and yet here they are shutting down, banning without any consultation, without any investigation, all U.S. airline traffic to Israel. And they did it while John Kerry was in Egypt en route to Israel to try to force Israel to accept Hamas's ceasefire proposal, which is now a U.S. ceasefire proposal. We have never been in a position like this, friends. We are in new, uncharted territory, and it is deeply, deeply disturbing. In addition, yesterday, the State Department spokeswoman gave a wink and a nod at the UN when she said that she didn't know that UN, we have reports out, the UN has acknowledged that the UN schools in Gaza not only were used as missile storage facilities, but that when the missiles were found, the UN gave the missiles to Hamas, so that the UN is actively participating in Hamas's actions against Israel, illegal criminal terrorist war against Israel. And what did Marie Harf say at the State Department briefing? Well, they don't know about that. They have to check with local authorities about what the veracity of that claim is by the UN. Local authorities in Gaza are Hamas terrorists, as she knows, but she called them local authorities. All of this shows what? It shows the bankruptcy of a policy that the United States has right now and has had for the past 2 decades, actually, as a centerpiece of their Middle East policy, which is establishing a Palestinian state in areas controlled by Israel, areas that Israel has the legal right to sovereignty over under international law. Because it all inevitably leads to this, the United States siding with foreign terrorist organizations against America's most important Middle East ally, Israel, and taking actions that directly impact adversely Israel's economy and strategic viability, which is exactly what we've seen, friends, happen over the past several days. The act by the FAA, which you could see as a warning shot across the bow by the Obama administration, because it was so obviously political, because so obviously they were utilizing a double standard against Israel that exists nowhere else in real time. This was a warning shot across the bow by the Obama administration against Israel. Stopped, I think, largely because the heroic friend of Israel, Ted Cruz, told the Obama administration that he would put a Senate block on every single State Department appointment until they gave an explanation for the use of this double standard against Israel, as well as the remarkable act of former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who showed what a lie this was when he flew to Ben Gurion Airport on El Al after they closed U.S. civilian airline traffic to Israel. These were acts that forced the Obama administration's hand, particularly Senator Cruz's threat to Obama administration officials, and that was what stopped it this time. But they've already shown this is what we're capable of doing. We're willing to do this. We're willing to pretend that we're really concerned about the safety of civilian airline passengers when, in fact, what they're doing is exercising a form of economic warfare against Israel to cripple Israel's economy by blocking all airline traffic to Israel. And you can tell that I'm quite upset about it because it just was so shocking when they did this. Now, again, this is not that surprising. It's shocking, but it shouldn't be surprising because this is the endpoint, necessary endpoint of what an American policy of saying we support a two-state solution will lead to. Why? Because who are the Palestinians who are supposed to be establishing this state? It's not just about, these are people who can only be popular by being hostile towards Israel. The more hostile you are, the more popular you become. So that Today, you have PLO leader, supposed moderate, Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority president, who everybody upholds as the man, the knight in shining armor who's going to come in and save the day, who really just wants peaceful coexistence with Israel if we would only quit Jerusalem. He is accusing Israel of genocide. He is siding with every single Hamas demand. He is actively inciting against Israel and making clear that he seeks the annihilation of the Jewish state. Why? Because he is not wanting to alienate his people. Last night, we had tens of thousands of people in the West Bank, Palestinians, rioting against Israeli military forces en masse in several focal points around the West Bank at the orders of Hamas, with the collusion of Fatah forces that are trained by the United States, trained by the U.S. military throughout the West Bank. And it's not only that, of course, we know, right? Every inch of territory that Israel transfers to the Palestinians is used as a base for enemy operations against all of Israel, right? The missiles reached Eilat from Gaza yesterday. They've reached as far as Nahariya in Israel's north, the border with Lebanon. They can reach every spot in Israeli territory from Gaza today. Imagine what it'll be like if, God forbid, we end up leaving Judea and Samaria, the West Bank of the Jordan River. Prime Minister Netanyahu said we would have 20 Gazas. It's going to be even worse, because any guy with basically a slingshot hanging out on the hills outside of Ben Gurion Airport is going to be able to bring down a civilian airliner. Now they're closing down Israeli airspace to civilian airline traffic from abroad, isolating Israel literally, because you had some missiles shot down a mile from Ben Gurion Airport. This can happen every 5 minutes, just as Sderot and just as Ashkelon and just as Netivot are being shot at every 5 minutes from Gaza. You know, I mean, my friends who live about 20 miles away from Gaza, they had to move out of their house. Why? Because 5 children, 2 parents, they were getting shot at every 10 minutes. At night, throughout the night, because this is Ramadan. People are, of course, up all night long because they sleep all day long. Every 10 minutes they were getting shot at. And they had to leave. You can't live this way. And here's the United States Secretary of State coming in with a ceasefire offer that allows Hamas to regroup, that is essentially a reenactment, a repetition of Hamas's offer for a ceasefire that redounds entirely to Hamas's benefit. Also, you know, the two-state formula, right? They say, Israel, if you concede territory, you're going to have international legitimacy to defend yourself if you're attacked from those areas, right? So we left Gaza, and then we got cast lead. We had to go into Gaza again in 2009 and at the beginning of 2009 to defend ourselves against a missile onslaught just like this. And we got the Goldstone report from the UN Human Rights Committee, a misnamed organization if ever there was one, right? That won't go after Syria, that won't say anything about the fact that Christians are being crucified in Syria, right? And women are now being unbelievably oppressed in Iraq in unspeakable manners, women and girls. They won't say anything about that. They're opened up a criminal investigation for Israel against allegations of crimes against humanity and claimed that we had been guilty of them. And they're doing it again now. What international legitimacy are we getting? We're getting pogroms in Paris. There is no international legitimacy accrued to Israel's benefit because we're actually trying to appease and mollify the Palestinians, again, whose only popularity is determined by how much they hate Israel and how many acts of violence they can carry out against the Jewish people. Throughout the world, in this country, San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, Boston, Chicago, this is the only thing I can think of off my own head. You've had violent anti-Semitic riots going on by people claiming that they simply care about the people of Gaza. There's nothing here about peace. There's nothing here about human rights. There's nothing here about anything having to do with advancing the cause of humanity. These are anti-Semitic pogroms going on in the streets of this country. And this is what happens because the people who are supposed to say that Israel has a right to defend itself after we leave territory are never mollified by us leaving territory because they're not opposed to Israel's right to self-defense because we control it. They are opposed to Israel's right to self-defense in these areas because they are opposed to Israel's existence. And that has all been revealed over the past 2 weeks, and not for the first time. And again, where is the United States in this? When your country adopts as a centerpiece of its Middle East policy the establishment of a Palestinian terrorist state in areas that Israel is in control of, it is almost necessary, it is almost taken for granted that at the end of the day you're going to end up here. You're going to end up with an administration that is openly siding with, financing in time of war, a terrorist organization and taking actions that mount to economic warfare against Israel in time of war. Why? Because if you believe that the way forward in the Middle East is to establish an anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist state in areas that Israel controls and needs to maintain its existence because it can't survive without them, then you are going to join the campaign to destroy Israel. And that's what we're seeing today. In a way, we should be thankful that we're seeing it now, right? Why? Because we have a chance to stop. We have a chance to turn back and say, no, no, no. Just as Senator Cruz was doing this week with the FAA thing, we need action today on the Hill and everywhere throughout this country, throughout the United States, to say, enough already. This whole idea that we can move forward in any productive manner by establishing a terrorist state run by a foreign terrorist organization, that we can move forward, that this idea should be the centerpiece of our Middle East policy making, has to end. We have to stop this. And one last point about the Palestinians. You see, everybody says, well, if Israel gives up the West Bank, then you're going to strengthen Fatah, which they claim is a moderate organization, which through word and deed they prove on a daily basis that they are not. But assuming for a second, right, that there was some truth to this, we saw that moderate Fatah is the organization that received the Gaza Strip from Israel when Israel removed all of its civilians and military forces from the area in 2005. And 4 months later, Hamas won the elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council because they were considered to be the reason why the hated Jews had left Gaza. And then when that wasn't enough for them, they started throwing Fatah gunmen off the roofs of 15-foot homes and apartment buildings in Gaza and massacring them in firing squads and making them flee to Israel to be safe. Right? Because that's just the way it goes, to the roars of approval of the people of Gaza. So we know that even if Fatah is really the moderate organization that everybody claims it is, its lifespan after an Israeli withdrawal is about, at most, 6 months. And given the pace of events today, I'd say 6 days maybe, 6 minutes maybe. That's it. It's over. It's curtains for them as well. That's why every time that we end up in a situation like this, you have Mahmoud Abbas sounding like the last of the stormtroopers in his anti-Semitic libels and slanders against Israel and Jews, because he has to keep up with the Joneses. So this entire paradigm is crazy, and it has to end. It has to end. Just simply can't go on this way. It's not simply that the Americans look crazy, right? Because it's not just that Israel is fighting Hamas. It's fighting Hamas with the support of Egypt, of Saudi Arabia, of the United Arab Emirates, of Jordan. And the United States, against all of its major Arab allies in the region, is now standing with Hamas together with Qatar, the largest financier of jihadist organizations in the world today. They're the biggest financiers of ISIS, of al-Nusra, of Hamas, of Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm forgetting some. And Turkey as well. And Turkey as well. Who is enabling all of those foreign people from Europe and the United States to go into Syria to fight against Assad for al-Qaeda? Where are their training camps? Where are they receiving medical assistance? In Turkey. Turkey is enabling their war. They're enabling their takeover of Syria. ISIS, the people who are crucifying Christians, are being enabled by the Turks. And the United States is standing with Turkey and Qatar and Hamas against all of its major allies, not only Israel, but in the Arab world today. So it's not just that people think that America's crazy. This is horrible. If Americans think that they're not going to pay a price for this, they're living in la la land. And it's true, there are lots of crises going on here in this country, and they're horrible. Horrible crises going on in this country, but who do you think are really coming across those borders? Only children? Only gang members from Honduras, as if this wasn't bad enough a national security problem? You don't think that terrorists are coming across the border from Venezuela, where you have plane loads of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps people and Hezbollah landing in Caracas International Airport in the military terminal every single week and receiving Venezuelan passports? They can't come through the border too? Or Nicaragua, where the largest foreign embassy is the Iranian embassy? They can't come across the border too? Why? If they can do it from Honduras, why can't they come from Nicaragua? Anybody looking into this? This isn't going to be bad. Turning your backs on your major allies isn't going to be bad. Supporting a foreign terrorist organization that is pledged not only to annihilate world Jewry and the Jewish state, but also the United States, that is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, that is allied with Al-Qaeda, this isn't a problem. This is the American foreign policy today in the Middle East. This is it. This is what we're seeing. This is what exists. So, you know, this briefing was actually scheduled thanks to Ben Lerner and Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy several weeks ago, before this war started, and the purpose was for me to talk about my book, The Israeli Solution. I brought a copy just so you can see it. The Israeli Solution to One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East. Now, my book, unfortunately, is extremely relevant today as well. Why? Because what I say is exactly this. In a way, I foresaw exactly what's happening because it's a necessary conclusion of a foreign policy that is based upon empowering terrorists. And I said, this has to stop. And what we have to do moving forward is abandon support for Palestinian statehood and support instead the application in conformance with the law of nations of Israeli full sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, over the West Bank, and dismantling of the Palestinian Authority, which is at a minimum a gateway for a terrorist takeover of the areas that Israel vacates, and in actual fact is not a gateway, but is the foundations of a terrorist state in these areas. And the book, which is divided into 3 parts, says, A, in part 1, this is why the two-state solution will fail. This is why it has failed for 90 years, and why each time that it is tried and fails in the future, the forces of good throughout the world are going to be weakened, and the forces of evil throughout the world, the types of people that we're seeing right now in Gaza, are going to be empowered. The second part sets out the demographic, the geopolitical, the historical, and other bases for Israel's claim to sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, and explains that, in fact, the Palestinian claim to sovereignty to those areas is an issue of propaganda far more than history or international law. And that when we hear these areas referred to as occupied territories, what we're really hearing is a form of lawfare, where you use the language of law in order to harm the target of your defamation, rather than the letter of the law or actual law. There is no international law per se that gives the Palestinians a right to sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. However, the Israeli right to sovereignty over Judea and Samaria is backed by international law, is anchored in the law of nations, in the 1922 League of Nations mandate for Palestine, a document that has never been abrogated or superseded. And in the last part of this book, I talk about how the nations of the region and the nations of Europe mainly are going to respond to an Israeli decision to apply its laws and sovereign rights to Judea and Samaria. And what I show, and what we're seeing actually play out today in Gaza, is that what I show in my book, what I argue in part 3 of my book, is true. Because when we see the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Saudis and the UAE standing beside Israel against Qatar, Turkey, Hamas, and America, what we're seeing is exactly what I said. I said that the Sunnis of the region recognize the danger that the Palestinian terrorists constitute not only for Israel, but for them, because as part of a web of international jihadists that, as we see, span the entire region and indeed the world, Palestinian empowerment, Hamas empowerment, and make no mistake, Palestinian empowerment is Hamas empowerment, empowers all of the jihadists that are seeking the overthrow of the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, of the Hashemite regime or kingdom in Jordan, of the secular forces in Egypt run by the military, and so on and so forth. That is why they are not opposing what Israel is doing in Gaza. To the contrary, they're sitting around in shock that the United States is trying to force Israel to accept a ceasefire that enables Hamas to keep shooting at will. I said in my book that the party that will be most opposed to this is Europe. And we're seeing that too, right? Because what is going on in Europe? What is happening in Europe? Why have 9 synagogues been attacked in France over the past 10 days, I think it's been? 2 weeks? Is it because of what's happening in Gaza? Gaza is an enabler of the forces of radical Islam that have been growing in force from month to month in European capitals throughout Western Europe. It is an enabler. But they were doing this before. Mohammed Merah did not massacre Jewish children and a rabbi at the Toulouse Jewish Day School 2 years ago because of anything that Israel was doing in Gaza. And that other guy that other jihadist didn't massacre 5 people at the Jewish Museum in Brussels earlier this year because of anything that was happening in Gaza. They did it because they are genocidal Jew haters. And by the way, Mohammed Merah killed French armed forces, French soldiers, before he got to the Jewish Day School in Toulouse, because they oppose both Europe and the Jews. And that's why they're doing it. That's why they torch all of the neighborhoods in France and burn thousands of cars throughout France. It's not just anti-Jewish, it's anti-civilization. And that's what they're doing. And the governments are saying, look, we sort of support Israel, but what are they supposed to do? You can't get elected in these countries unless you try to mollify this growing demographic inside of Europe. And that's why none of them are protecting the Jews. I mean, think about what happened at that French synagogue a couple of weeks ago, at Avravanel synagogue. You had the Prime Minister of France talking to the chief rabbi of Paris, who was in the synagogue while it was being besieged by hundreds of rioters outside, saying, we stand with you. It took over a half an hour. He was there on the phone before the French police came. It took them over a half an hour to arrive at the synagogue. The only reason that the synagogue wasn't overrun was because you had Jewish communal security details protecting the synagogue for a half an hour before the French riot police arrived. What were they doing for a half an hour? Was it really that hard for them to arrive? What were they waiting for? The prime minister could get to the synagogue by telephone before the riot police could come? And then they come, but the next day the people are back and they're not there. So who's providing protection for the Jews? The Jews. That's it. On a daily basis, it's not the French government that's protecting them. In Frankfurt, you had policemen who participated in an anti-Semitic march a week and a half ago. They allowed the anti-Semitic rioters calling slaughter the Jews to use the police loudspeaker on the police patrol car that was there to shout their message louder. This is what's happening in Europe. So what do we think? Of course, Europe is going to be opposed to an Israeli decision to actually apply our sovereign rights to Judea and Samaria. And this brings us back to the United States. And one of the critiques of my book was that I didn't talk about the United States. I didn't say what America would do in response to such an Israeli action, because the purpose of this book, which I wrote for the American audience, is to convince Americans. In Israel, we already know. The vast majority of Israelis understand that land concessions to the Palestinians brings only war. And if anybody had any doubt, let me tell you, the last 3 weeks convinced them as well. We cannot give them any more land. We cannot survive if we do. And we get it. But the Americans are still running around saying two-state solution, two-state solution. Let's give $440 million of U.S. taxpayer money to Palestinian terrorists every year. And by the way, let's shut down, again, civilian airline traffic to Tel Aviv, just out of an abundance of caution. So I wrote this in order to explain to the United States, stop. What you're doing is harming yourselves. Israelis will figure it out. We have to. We didn't come there in order to destroy ourselves. We didn't rebuild a Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile in order to be destroyed. And we won't be. But what about America? What about America? What's America doing to itself by siding with its worst enemies against its allies? It's not protecting any American lives by doing so. It's not protecting U.S. national security by doing so. So no, I didn't say how America would respond, but I did say how America should respond. And here, too, when we go to where we are today, right, when we go to where we are today, there are things. Senator Cruz stopped the FAA ban on flights to Israel this week. He stopped it through Senate oversight. Thank God he did. But the U.S. Congress has a lot of things that they can do to roll back this policy. I'm just going to give you a couple of asks, as they say in Washingtonese. Look, today, this week, as I said, the UN Human Rights Committee said that they were going to have an official investigation of alleged Israeli war crimes in Gaza, right? The only people really who are alleging it are CNN anchors, but whatever, you know. But they all agreed. The Americans were the only ones who voted against it. By the way, what is the United States doing exactly at the UN Human Rights Committee? That's a question to be asked by Congress. But the other question is, why should we be funding the UN Human Rights Committee or the UN when they're doing this kind of revolting anti-Semitic propaganda? We are funding a Kafkaesque tribunal against the Jewish people by giving them U.S. money. And the United States funds 22% of the UN budget. 22%. Put a hold on it. Put a hold on it. Just like the U.S. Congress put a hold on UNESCO funding after they recognized Palestine. Put a hold on the budgetary allocations to the UN Human Rights Committee. No money. No money. And if they keep doing it, no money to the UN. Jesse Helms did it. Can do it. Do it. While we are fighting Hamas in Gaza, while 6 million people in Israel are being forced to sit in bomb shelters, take their children into bomb shelters at night, while you have thousands of Israelis who are living in areas abutting Gaza that are now seeing tunnels into their communities that were supposed to be used for massacring them, for kidnapping them, and for bombing their children. While we're seeing that, in Europe, they're extending and widening their economic warfare against Israel. You have the French, you have the British, you have other nations in Europe that are now passing restrictions calling for labeling of Israeli goods. You're having them barring their national entities from doing business with Israeli companies that also work in Judea and Samaria, which means all Israeli companies to all intents and purposes. This is a European version of the Arab economic boycott of Israel. The United States was able to deal with this very well, right? By passing laws that said, if you are a part of this boycott, you cannot do business you cannot receive federal contracts, you cannot do business with the American government. If you are a part of this, you cannot do business with America, and it was effective. Unfortunately, now it's going to have to be done to the French government, because these are the anti-Jewish legislations that are being passed by parliaments in Europe at the behest of the European Union. Economic warfare is going on hand in hand, accompanying these Hamas missile barrages, this Hamas criminal war against the Jewish people from Gaza that is now being actively assisted by rioters throughout Judea and Samaria at their behest. I'm going to stop here because I want you guys to be able to ask me questions before we let out today. And I know everybody's busy, and I do really appreciate you taking part of your Friday morning to speak to me. But I just want to say, I know that the American people in general do not support what's happening with this government, do not support the administration signing with a foreign terrorist organization against the state of Israel. I know it. And this is the people's house. This is where you can allow your voices to be heard. This is where the people can represent that opposition to this administration. And this is where it has to start. It's important, these protests and these counter-protests against these anti-Jewish pogromists throughout the United States. That's important, but it's important for Congress to act as individuals, putting holds on appointments, putting holds on allocations of money, whether it's Kay Granger or it's Ted Cruz in the aviation subcommittee, responsible for the FAA, in the Senate, whoever it is, put a hold on their money, stop funding UN, start calling Europe to account for their anti-Semitic economic boycotts of Israel that are now government-sponsored. Hold people to account and hold this administration to account. I'm sorry to come in here and say it, but this administration is siding with Hamas today in this war. They're pushing a ceasefire that is Hamas's ceasefire offer. It has to be opposed because it's not just Israel that's at stake. It's the United States of America. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Carolyn, let me just say at the outset, Congressman Lamborn had to run to another meeting and regretted very much having to only hear part of what you had to say. He was struggling mightily to both be here, which is really where he wanted to be, and attend to his other duties, so he sort of split the proverbial baby.
He did a good job this time.
You have done a good job, an extraordinary job, as you always do, in laying out the challenge. I think the only thing that I would add to it is this is in a way a microcosm of the larger failure of the administration's policy. We have in fact aligned ourselves with Islamist enemies of this country far beyond Hamas and for that matter Fatah. It is another meeting, a crisis of the first order that is simply manifesting itself in a kind of microcosmic way. It seems mightily to me here. It's just that it is of such existential, which is really where he wanted to be, and attend to his other duties. That we not do that. Split the proverbial baby. It will ultimately be an existential threat. You have done a good job, I think, extraordinary job, as you just reinforce the point in laying out the challenge in closing. I think the only thing that I would add to it is this is just in a way a microcosm. This is about us as well. Of the larger failure. So with that, let's the administration's policy. Debbie, we have please introduce yourself. Aligned ourselves.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss from Page Magazine. Thank you, Caroline, for such a great and informative presentation as always. Last night I was watching television, and obviously the bias is all in the other direction. I was appalled that I saw a man who is Jewish and lives in Israel and was working on a BDS campaign from within, and I'm totally siding against the Israeli military. I was wondering if you could comment on the internal threats within Israel, and if you see it growing or if it's a concern, and how people like him should be treated by the government. He used to be in the IDF, by the way.
Just want to greet Congressman Trent Franks, another truly wonderful friend of Israel. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. I don't know who you were speaking about, but look, I mean, you know, it is a tried and true way of getting quoted by the likes of Tom Friedman and others to be an Israeli who opposes Israel. And so it's not at all surprising that this person was interviewed by whatever news organization trying to be the new Al Jazeera was interviewing him. The fact of the matter is that, you know, you have 80% support for the operation in Gaza among Israelis. So that, and I would dare say that the 20% that oppose it are actually not 20%, but less, and it's just a question of polling data, but it doesn't matter. The point is that what we see happening, and you know, I saw it I see it on a daily basis among the Foreign Diplomatic Corps inside of Israel, is that there is a community of Israeli Jews. They're very, very radicalized, very anti-Israel, and they're really the people who foreign journalists and foreign envoys speak to. I remember this one time, several years ago, the deputy ambassador of Britain asked to meet with me. And I met with him a couple of times, and I remember the first time that I met with him, he just was agape, mouth agape, couldn't believe what I was saying about whatever it happened to be at the time. I've never heard an Israeli speak like this. And I said, well, who have you been talking to? And they were all radical leftists. And so this man, to his credit, actually reached out to somebody who represented the vast majority of Israelis to see what I thought. And I said, have you checked the opinion polls of Israel? Have you seen where the public is on whatever issue it happened to have been? And I apologize for not remembering. But there was over 60% of Israelis at the time who were supporting exactly what I was telling him, and he never spoke to anybody who had the views of the overwhelming majority of Israelis. Because, you know, this is what you get. You have a closed, insulated community of radicals inside of Israel, many of whom who operate in these various NGOs are fully funded by foreign governments. And they are the voices of Israel that are not representing anybody in particular in Israel, that are constantly called on by the media and, again, by the Foreign Diplomatic Corps to tell people what Israelis really think.
Dan Pollock with the Zionist Organization of America. You know a lot of the personalities of the people who are going to be making the decision about what to do about this carrier proposal. Can you tell us a little bit about your prognosis? Is Israel likely to fold into this American pressure? I mean, obviously they can't, because we've just had demonstrated what the concrete that's been imported is being used for. You can't very well say no conditions on what's brought into the country, which is one of the elements of the Hamas ceasefire proposal.
Look, I mean, the problem is that we're facing severe threats from all fronts, right? We have al-Qaeda that is in control of the Syrian side of the border in Golan Heights. We have Hezbollah that is in charge of the border in Lebanon. And I'm sure that there are tunnels crossing over to the Galilee. So, you know, one of the things, aside from the FAA, which was just, I mean, you know, I thought I'd seen everything. I was actually, personally, I was just so shocked by it, I just couldn't even imagine, is that the Americans convinced Israelis, in our wisdom, agreed to use F-16s as our main fighter jets and other American military platforms. So, you know, in any military engagement, you're going to need spare parts. And so the question is really how much pressure and coercive force is going to be brought to bear on Israel in order to have a ceasefire, how long we can maintain our defense against this threat from Gaza if the United States is really interested in harming us. And so that's another question, and it goes back to congressional oversight. It goes back to the question of, you know, Armed Services Committee should be looking into, are there any Israeli requests for spare parts that are not being fulfilled today? These are things that the Congress can make inquiries with the Defense Department, with whomever it is, in order to ensure that these kinds of coercive measures aren't used against Israel. Extremely important. This, by the way, was something that Congress did to great effect in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, when Kissinger opposed resupply of Israel. I think it was Scoop Jackson who played an instrumental role, a Democrat, wonderful, great American hero, who played an instrumental role in convincing Nixon to essentially reject the advice of the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, and send spare parts and other war material to Israel in the middle of that war. So again, Congress has a history of being able to step in and ensure that Israel is able to survive against the will or whatever, or in the face of administration opposition to arming Israel in the middle of battle. So I think that that's very important, and it has to be a consideration because again, an administration that can use a double standard against Israeli civilian air traffic, as we've seen this this week is playing in a completely different ballgame than anything that we've seen in the past. So again, this requires congressional oversight urgently and constantly, and vigilance.
Carolyn, I had the privilege, as you know, of working for Scoop Jackson, and if there is one like him on the Hill at the moment, certainly in this chamber,
It's
is
Trent
our
Franks.
friend Trent Franks. And I remember even briefly, and I failed to both acknowledge you, Congressman, properly a moment ago, and to give you a chance to say at least a few words before you have to scoot. Thank you very much for coming and for all you do for all of us on so many fronts, but not least this one.
Well, I wish you could know how mutual the heart and the feelings are toward all of you guys. I do have a question for you, Caroline, but and I'll just take 1 minute to express my gratitude for the chance to be here with all of you and just to greet all of you and thank you for what you're doing. I think this is a pivotal moment for Israel. The last floor speech that we gave on behalf of Israel, which was obviously very critical of the administration's failures to really respond as they should, has gained more resonance and reaction among the American people than just about anything we've done for the last 6 months. It's really been so there's a lot of people out there that understand the situation, and it's important that we give Israel the diplomatic Iron Dome that they need right now. We predicted here a week and a half ago that at some point some school is going to be blown up, maybe by Hamas. We don't know. You know, if Hamas cared half as much about their own children as Israel cares about Hamas children, it would be a totally different equation. And I think that right now the most important thing that we can articulate is somehow this insidious mindset on the part of the terrorists there, where they will use children, they will use any tragedy and even precipitate tragedy in order to try to make Israel look like they're unfeeling and they don't care, when they're really trying to do everything they can to protect their own citizens. So God bless you all for what you're doing in that regard. I have every conviction that this is going to be all right for at least the time being, but we need to be very vigilant because the issues are profound. So my question to Caroline, I think that any policy debate on Israel that we have in this chamber or this country should take into consideration this lady's magnificent insight and her overall understanding of the geopolitical and the architectural makeup of the issue and of Israel's dynamic challenges every time they turn around. I think her voice is critically important. So I'll just ask her a really easy question. What is the one most important thing Congress can do to help Israel in these moments?
Right now, I think that thank you so much, Congressman, and really you are you are a blessing to Israel, and we appreciate you and your dedication, not only to the safety and security of Israel, but also to your courageous stand at all times to the cause of freedom throughout the world. We appreciate it very much, and we know that we can count on you, and so we want to just thank you here for everything that you do on behalf of American national security and also on behalf of Israel's national security. I think that right now, the most important thing that that Congress can do to help Israel is to, I would want to investigate what happened, why the FAA closed Ben Gurion Airport. I think it's important, and I don't just say this because it was so shocking. It's because, and it's not just the direct economic damage that it caused to Israel, it's that the United States acted essentially in collusion with a terrorist organization to say, we are collaborating with you in your efforts to paralyze Israel's economy. We are collaborating with you in your desire to make Israel's economy hostage to the whims of your field commanders and when they're going to shoot missiles. And when you have that coupled with the American call for an immediate ceasefire, that involves ending all Israeli operations against the subterranean tunnels that Hamas has dug inside of Israeli territory, this is a position that is simply hostile to Israel in time of war by the administration. So I think it's very important not to let go of this and say, okay, they lifted their flight ban, never mind. We need an investigation about why this happened. It's important to deter it from ever occurring again and to ensure that it doesn't. We also need to ensure from the Defense Appropriations Committee that the supply of spare parts to Israel in times of war is not questioned, that it is automatic, that requests for whatever components we need for our F-16s to continue to protect Israel over the skies of Gaza are given in time, that there's no fear on Israel's part that we're not going to be able to continue fighting in our own defense. And again, when you see the threats emanating as well, waiting in Lebanon, waiting in Syria, we have to ensure that those are taken care of. That's in the immediate term, and also clear congressional warnings to the Europeans as they move forward in their economic boycotts of the Israeli economy, that whether it's France or the United Kingdom or Denmark or Norway, that they're going to risk their business in the United States if they enact anti-Semitic legislation that either forces Israel to have special labels for its exports to Europe, you know, as people have said, like a current-day version of the Yellow Star, or if they say that they are not going to do business with Israeli entities, which is just about every single Israeli business that does business as well beyond the 1949 armistice lines. Those actions should be met with action by the Congressional Commerce Committees saying you should be put on warning, you are going to pay a price for enacting anti-Semitic legislation inside of Europe. So those are the things that I think that Congress can do now. And then the last thing that Congress can do for the Appropriations Subcommittee of the Foreign Relations Committee did not put in aid to the Palestinian Authority for the fiscal year 2015. However, in their explanatory notes, they already have in their language for restrictions on a presidential waiver for enabling that aid to move forward. And by including the language for the waiver inside of the explanatory notes of the funding bill, it makes clear that the House assumes that that aid is going to be restored at some point in the markup process of the foreign appropriations bill, and I think that it has to not be put in at any point in the legislative process. I don't think that it should be saying, well, we don't want it. It's not an expression of opposition. It has to be an act of opposition that blocks it. Period. No more funding to Palestinian terrorists by U.S. taxpayers. Those are the specific things that I think are very important today. Yeah, so thank you.
Congressman, thank you so much. I know you'll go forth and execute.
We are in the process of many of those things, including
Wonderful.
the supplemental for the Iron Dome, additional rounds, because that's a situation stuck in the Senate. I guess that shocks you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you with
Thank
us.
you.
Other questions? Sarah.
Thank you, Carolyn. Brilliant as usual. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Sarah Stern from the Endowment for Middle East Truth. A couple of things. Unfortunately, yesterday we had a conference call with General Yaakov Amidror. And on the way in, I was listening to Ambassador Ron Dermer. Both of them had said that the ball is basically in Hamas's court, that Secretary of State Kerry, together with Egypt, have put forth this peace proposal, quote unquote. As you said, 60% of the population of Israel is basically with you. And
80.
80 here, right, okay. Now, I know that there's this huge stranglehold that the government of Israel feels that they are in because of the isolation in the international community. How do we convince them that the objective of this operation is just not to be quiet with quiet, but to actually make sure that the people of Israel do not have to once again go back into their sealed rooms and shelters every 18 months to 2 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much for your question and for all you do. Look, it's not that the cabinet needs to be convinced. The problem is that we are facing two wars, and the objective of one makes it difficult to accomplish the objective of the other. We have to defeat Hamas on the ground, and we have to prevent the West, the Europeans and the Americans, from destroying our economy. And what they're saying is that if you defend yourself on the ground against Hamas, you're going to destroy your economy. That was the message of the FAA ban on the flights. And so I think that the government is already in a very difficult and dangerous position. And we have to add to that, of course, that Obama has just given the Iranians until now, another 3 months, is it 4 months? 4 months to continue building their nuclear weapons until after the congressional elections. And, the deal that the Iranians objected to, that they didn't accept in the nuclear talks that they're holding with the United States and the other permanent 5 members of the Security Council and the UN and Germany, was an offer that would enable them to build nuclear weapons, right? Because it gave them continued, or it legalized their right to enrich uranium in contravention of the signatures that they've already given to the additional protocols of the NPT. So the deal that Iran was offered and rejected was actually a deal that would have enabled them to continue building nuclear weapons, is in the mix when the Israeli government is trying to figure out how to handle the coercive measures that John Kerry is bringing to bear. And by the way, you think that he's not bringing them to bear against the Egyptians as well? I mean, he is. So it's just, it's a problem. We have to defend ourselves, and the world is making it increasingly difficult for us to do so. And I don't envy anybody in the security cabinet. I understand, and the Israeli people understand, that their primary responsibility is to defend Israel. But okay, we destroy Hamas, they destroy our economy. How do you square the circle? How do you thread this needle? How do you get through this storm when those are the things that are in play? What's more important from a short-term perspective, unfortunately, I think, is the calculation that the Israeli government is being forced to make as a result of the flight ban this week. Yes, sir. No, yeah.
Caroline, thank you. I'm Chief of Staff for Congressman Bridenstine. My name is Joe Kaufman.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Each representative in this body represents over 700,000 people. Long term, and perhaps even nearer term, the important thing is to sway American public opinion on this matter. And my question is, how can members of Congress and their staffs best advance the truth that the fate of America is inextricably intertwined with that of Israel?
Well, I mean, the cutesy answer is have them read my book, but just, a more serious or less serious, whatever, response to that question is the United States is hated because of what it is. It's not hated because of what it does. It's hated because of what it is. The people who attacked the United States on 9/11, the people who have tried to blow up civilian jetliners since then have thankfully been prevented from doing so en route to the United States, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, and so on and so forth. They don't hate the United States because it supports Israel. They hate the United States because the United States represents human freedom. I mean, these are people like, again, I don't even feel like saying it, but it was reported yesterday that ISIS in Mosul just promulgated a law requiring the genital mutilation of every single female between the ages of 11 and 46. their hatred for the United States would be just as strong if there was no Israel, if there was never a Jew in the world. These are people who are evil, who reject human freedom, and that is why they want to destroy the United States, because the United States is about human freedom and essentially nothing else. Because everything else, free markets, free trade, all of that is a consequence of being about freedom. That's the be-all and end-all of America, and that's why they hate America. And that is why they hate Israel. And the stronger that these forces get by, for instance, harming Israel in any way, shape, or form, the more empowered they will feel in their ability to achieve their ultimate objective, which is world domination through the annihilation of the United States of America. And I think that is the key insight that people have to understand. You cannot appease people who want to do that to female human beings, children and adults. You cannot appease people who crucify Christians. You can't. You can't appease them. There's nothing to be done. You have to fight them. You have to defeat them. And Hamas is doing the same thing. Now, the reason why the Palestinians are considered, for some reason, to be different from ISIS, different from Osama bin Laden, different from all of these monsters in human form, is because they are primarily attacking Jews. And if they were primarily attacking Christians, people would recognize that there's no distinction. But because their primary target is the Jews, people pretend that there's a distinction, and that a victorious Hamas, God forbid, wouldn't move on from there to Jordan, to Egypt, to America. They will. And I think that that's the primary point that has to be raised. Because, you know, I mean, I was talking on my way here to my nephew, who's interning at the Senate this summer, and I said, look, you know, we have had American presidents in the past who it has been exposed after they left office that they were hostile towards Jews. I mean, if you listen to the Nixon tapes, right, everybody says, oh, Nixon was an anti-Semite. So he was pro-American. Because at the end of the day, he recognized, love them or hate them, the Jews were the front line of America's strategic defense in the Middle East. And that is why, over the objections of his Secretary of State, who was Jewish, Nixon resupplied Israel in the Yom Kippur War in October of 1973 and enabled Israel to win that war. It wasn't for love of Israel, it was for love of America that he did it. And that's why, love it or hate it, whatever you think of Jews is immaterial. If every hair that falls from the head of an Israeli in this war, in this endless war that we're seeing the latest round of today, is a hair off the heads of an American. And that's, I think, the primary insight that has to be communicated to everybody in this country as things become more and more ambiguous.
Carolyn, could I just, I'm sorry I had to lose myself for a minute, but I came in partway through that last answer, and could I just both say and maybe invite you to just address, sadly, it may be the case that Hamas is not attacking primarily Christians at the moment, but an awful lot of other Islamists in the region are doing that with murderous effect. And yet we're seeing precious little response from Christians, or for that matter, Christian sort of rooted governments anywhere in the world in response to what is now, you know, a fairly systematic kind of pogrom, I guess you would call it, against them as well. Yeah, so, I mean, I guess if you wouldn't mind just connecting those dots, that it reinforces what I understood was your fundamental point. This is a war against all of us. It's not just against the Jews. You're maybe a speed bump on the road to everybody else, but you're certainly part of the larger target set.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, when you look at what the Presbyterian Church in the USA did right, earlier this year, in imposing a boycott of Israel and embracing the annihilation of Israel as one of their, I wouldn't say catechisms, but certainly the political goals of that church. There's a problem. Anglican Church, Church of Israel, the Church of England, I mean, they also have become extremely anti-Semitic. You know, and unfortunately, in Pope Francis's visit to Israel earlier this year as well, I mean, he went to Bethlehem and he stood beside a section of Israel's security fence joining Bethlehem to Jerusalem that was built to prevent suicide bombers. Like the one, for instance, that detonated at Hillel Cafe in 2002 and murdered the head of the emergency medicine department in Shaarei Tzedek, along with his daughter the evening before her marriage, her wedding. They were calling him, you know, to get him to come and help save the victims of the bombing that he and his daughter were killed in. They came from Bethlehem, as did many other suicide bombers. So that security barrier was built to block that from happening again, and the Pope, unfortunately, stood beside a section of the barrier that had graffiti on it comparing the security barrier to the wall around the Warsaw Ghetto. And he met with the Mufti of Jerusalem, who has called for the genocide of world Jewry in an ecumenical interfaith service. So, you know, unfortunately, for whatever reason, Western churches are choosing to be silent, at best, in the face of the mass slaughter of Christians throughout the Middle East, and in many cases are actually siding with the people who are killing them against the Jews. And I think that there's a real growth opportunity here for Christians who care about the continuation of Christian presence in the Middle East and oppose crucifixion and female genital mutilation to actually stand up and have their voices heard in their churches in the United States and in Europe. So we're in a very precarious moment in the history of Western civilization, and I'm sure that many who have been silent until now will finally recognize that they have to stand up and shout.
Amen. Patrick?
Patrick Poole, what has the position of the Egyptians been? We've behind the scenes in all this, because it does seem that Hamas's ultimate goal is the permanent reopening of the Rafah border crossing.
That is their main concern, actually. And you see that in their ceasefire demands of Israel, they're demanding that Egypt open the border between Gaza and Egypt. So, well, I mean, we see it on the ground. The Egyptians were just pouring sewage into the smuggling tunnels across the border from Sinai, Egyptian Sinai to Rafah, to Gaza. Yesterday it was reported. So, you know, that the Egyptian military last year overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, which was openly seeking to transform Egypt into an Islamic republic, openly, overtly seeking to do so. I mean, Morsi had conferred to himself absolute powers to run Egypt with no oversight by any governing body whatsoever. And he was already taking steps towards implementing Sharia law in Egypt through constitutional reform that was supported by the Obama administration. And the military, and by the way, they were doing it at the same time that Egypt's foreign reserves were essentially gone, and Egypt had no ability to feed its own people. So they needed an enormous amount of money, which Qatar, by the way, was giving them. They gave them, I think, $12 billion or something when they came in. So they were bankrolling the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood. And what the Egyptian military is contending, and I think rightly, is that Hamas was acting as the shock troops of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt when they were overthrowing the Mubarak government, when they freed all of these Muslim Brotherhood terrorists from Egyptian prisons. Those prison breaks were organized and carried out by Hamas terrorists who had gone through the tunnels from Gaza into the Sinai and then went from there to the northern Sinai, or to the southern Sinai, to areas around the city of Suez, and were opening up these prisons and getting all of these Hamas leaders, including Mohammed Morsi, actually, out of jail and into leadership positions in Egypt. So the Egyptians are acutely aware that Hamas, as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, constitutes the largest threat to the viability of the Egyptian state. And that's why they have been strangling Hamas economically and from a war material perspective, by blocking the transfer of both funding and war material, trainers, etc., that had been going through an underground tunnels highway connecting Egypt to Gaza, that the weapons had been coming in from Sudan, traversing Egypt, and then through the Sinai into Gaza. That was the highway, and the current military government, Sisi's government, has been blocking it. So, you know, the Egyptians have been very clear. I mean, the ceasefire that they tried to implement before Israeli ground troops were introduced to Gaza last week, you know, was a ceasefire that Israel could agree to because it gave Hamas no advantages for having to gone to war against Israel. So they had already shot, I think, over 1,000 missiles at population centers in Israel by the time that the ground forces were introduced. And so what the Egyptian ceasefire that was offered last week, that John Kerry decided wasn't enough, right? The Americans essentially rejected, which is why Hamas rejected it. That ceasefire would have said, okay, Hamas, you get nothing for your troubles, and therefore you are humiliated, therefore you are defeated, therefore you're not going to extend your credibility either in Egypt or throughout the Arab world. And that was the basis of the Egyptian ceasefire. So from all of the things that the Egyptians have been doing on the ground, it's very clear that they don't want a ceasefire. I mean, if Israel's already fighting, they want Israel to conclude successfully its mission in Gaza, because doing so redounds to the immediate benefit of Egypt. And if Israel stops short and Hamas accomplishes something that they're able to present to the Islamic world as an accomplishment, this will endanger Egypt.
Claire Lopez.
Claire Lopez with the Center for Security Policy. More on the tunnels. Obviously, the tunnels have been incredibly important to Hamas in terms of bringing in not just weapons and explosives and terrorists and supplies, all of that. But now the main objective of the Israeli forces going in there is to destroy these tunnels. Well, how effective can it be if the tunnels can be really shut down, or the majority of them, in really pressuring Hamas? And then how possible do you think it might be to maintain the tunnels being shut down without the IDF, without Israel occupying Gaza again?
Those are really good questions. I mean, I think that it's very clear that the primary goal of this operation is to destroy the tunnels. This has been made clear by the government, and unfortunately, due to the fact that there haven't been Israeli boots on the ground in Gaza essentially for 9 years, they've been able to build this entire infrastructure of terror underground with no oversight. And what they were saying was that Israel was so taken aback by the breadth of the tunnel operation because they've been using civilian smugglers to do it. So they haven't been specifically Hamas operatives that Israel's satellites and other signals intelligence assets might have picked up. They were civilians that Israel might not have necessarily been looking at, which is why Israelis were so shocked by the extent of the tunnel networking. Now these tunnels are just sort of shocking in the versatility of the kinds of operations that they can enable Hamas to accomplish, whether it's using dozens or even hundreds of fighters going through simultaneously through a number of tunnels at once that are going to take them out inside of Israeli communities along the border with Gaza, and enacting a multi-pronged massacre of Israeli populations inside of those border communities, or if it's, as we saw, the abduction en masse of Israeli civilians from these areas, and they're spiriting them back to Gaza, again, in a simultaneous, multi-pronged operation through a number of tunnels simultaneously. Or if it, as we have seen, is a detonation either simultaneously or individually of some of the high-tonnage bombs that we have seen that have been ready for detonation upon receipt of orders underneath Israeli kindergartens and other civilian targets. These tunnels represent a threat that Israel simply cannot abide by the continued existence of. You cannot expect people to live in areas that they're afraid that while they're lying in their beds trying to fall asleep or putting their children to sleep at night, that before morning comes, those children of theirs are going to be abducted or slaughtered because there are tunnels underneath their beds. You can't live like that. So the imperative of destroying this tunnel network has to be abundantly clear, which is why one of these things about the American ceasefire proposal is that it demands an immediate cessation of all combat operations, including Israeli operations to find and destroy these tunnels. You know, missiles, we have our Iron Dome, thank God, but what do you do against people popping out of the ground and massacring you? You can only destroy the means of accomplishing that mission. The minute that they're in that tunnel, they're essentially already attacking you. So this is something that just can't end until that's accomplished.
Carolyn, this really calls to mind very vividly the warnings that you, among others of us, but you particularly effectively expressed about not giving up Gaza in the first place. And I know you would just as soon not say, I told you so, but you certainly are entitled to. Anybody else? Questions or comments? You actually have the mic yourself. Over to you.
Good morning, Ms. Glick. I have to say, I picked up your book the first day I saw it and read it immediately, and it reminded me actually of another book by...
You might introduce yourself if you would.
Sorry. David Daoud, Center for Security Policy.
Okay.
Intern. So it reminded me of Benny Morris's book, One State, Two States. And one thing you two agree on is that the two-state solution is an absolute disaster, at least as the situation is on the ground today. But the alternative of one state, how would that work, even given, you know, your book makes the argument that the demographic is skewed and that the Palestinians actually number a lot less than, you know, the numbers claim. They would still, I mean, incorporating them into Israeli society would give them about 40% of Israeli society. How would we avoid a situation like Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Yugoslavia, anywhere where, you know, you had two populations that have historical enmity living under the same national roof?
Well, we already have that, right? I mean, we have it now. The Palestinians are inside of Israel's sovereign territory. I mean, you have Judea and Samaria on the one side, you have Hamas, you know, and Gaza on the other side. And so we're already dealing with that thing. It's an optical illusion to see it as something that will happen. It's already happening. And we see what happens when you have this population living under a hostile regime that is indoctrinating them to destroy Israel. And you see the destructive capabilities that they're able to constitute to Israel as a result of the presence of this hostile regime west of the Jordan River that is sharing control of this geographical entity, Judea and Samaria, with Israel. So, you know, again, you know, it's society, well, if they are part of Israel, they are part of Israel. And right now they're a part of Israel that is governed by terrorists. And this is what we're getting as a consequence. So, I mean, last night, they had thousands and thousands of people rioting on the outskirts of Jerusalem. In Calandia, you had it in Shechem, in Nablus, you had it in Ramallah, in Tulkarem. And they're able to do that today because they are run by the Palestinian Authority, which facilitates this, which indoctrinates them to participate in it as well, which lionizes everybody who does participate in it and rewards it. Now, am I saying that all of them are going to become Zionists if Israel takes over? No. And I'm also not saying that all of them are going to become citizens. What I'm saying is that they're going to get permanent residency status, which grants them all of the civil rights that Israelis have, and the only thing that they wouldn't get at an initial stage is voting rights for the Knesset. And if they are able to abide by the criterion of Israel's naturalization law, then they would be eligible for citizenship as well. But that really wouldn't kick into force for several years. And by the way, you know, people who are active members of terrorist organizations would not be eligible for Israeli citizenship, obviously. But what you would have is Israeli law enforcement rather than Palestinian terrorist militias in charge of these areas. You know, why is it that the Arabs of the Galilee, you know, they can riot for a day or two, but that's not sustainable over time? Because the Israeli police are the only law enforcement entity that operates in those areas. So, you know, they can't sustain the kind of rioting in the Galilee and the Negev. It's not that they don't have people in the Galilee and the Negev who support Hamas and seek the obliteration of Israel. It's simply that they don't have the capability, they don't have the wherewithal to carry out suicide bombings, to gain missile technology, to whatever it happens to be that you were able to do under Hamas in Gaza, and that you would be able to do under Hamas in Judea and Samaria if a Palestinian state is saying. So again, in what I say in my book, I didn't actually choose the title, The Israeli Solution. That was Random House's choice. But Israel is the only thing that works in the Middle East today. And so what the two-state solution is we want more terrorists in charge and less of Israel. And what my book, The Israeli Solution, says is, no, we want less terrorist control. We want more Israel. And that's, you know, a first step towards beginning to restore sanity and to expand the zone of freedom in the Middle East is by expanding the zone of freedom of Israel. And so I think that's the basic notion behind my book. Go with what works. Don't go with what's broken. Then more might work and less will be broken, just, you know, as a first step forward. And I don't know whether you saw it, but this gentleman over here has been raising his hand for quite some time. So.
I have not seen it. We're right up against the stop, so quickly, please.
I'll make it quick. Thank you. My name's Matt Beaver. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain and a stalwart friend of Israel.
Thank
About
you.
a third of the way through your wonderful and compelling book.
Thanks. I appreciate it very much that you came.
You made a distinction, or you noted the distinction that we make between Fatah and Hamas, which isn't really helpful. When I hear the term Islamist, Islamic radical, I think sometimes that we're crippling our ability to have a really frank discussion of the threat when we use those terms. And I just wonder, isn't it high time that we just called Islam for what it is? It's a barbaric ideology, and the threat isn't Islamists or Islamic radicals. The threat is Islam. And we should use terms like Islam being the threat and jihadist perpetrating the threat, and just speak in clear and simple terminology and not feed, I think, a false narrative by using terms that the opposition would like to hear, like Islamic radicals. I
don't think that anybody wants to hear Islamic radicals. I mean, you have the White House saying you're not allowed to talk about terrorism, let alone Islam. I mean, let alone Islamism, let alone jihad. I mean, they're saying that a war on terror, which was itself, as you say, a misnomer, because it should have been called, you know, as Frank Gaffney called it at the time, a war against Islamofascism, whatever you want to call it, but it wasn't terrorism. Terrorism was the means that they used to achieve their goals. Today, they're using extended means, you know, like circumcising women, right? I mean, they're doing all kinds of crucifixion. Is that a form of terrorism? I don't know, maybe just barbarism, war against barbarism. What do you want to call it? But the point is that, you know, all of this terminology, the fact that federal agencies are barred from using language that could actually enable them to explain reality to one another or to discuss it, whether you want to call it Islamism, Islam, radical Islam, jihad, terrorism, bad guys, Sharia, whatever you want to call it, you know, evildoers, not allowed to say that either, right? Everything has to be sterilized into some sort of a language that doesn't enable you to actually even understand reality if you use it, which is exactly, of course, like Orwell's Newspeak in 1984, and it should be terrifying to everybody that you could have these kinds of constraints on language in the United States of America, and certainly in the federal government. So would it be better if these bans were removed? Yes, of course they would. You have to start somewhere. And what this book does, I think, is it says start here. Start here. Start with the centerpiece of U.S. Middle East policy, which is is to squeeze Israel into borders that will enable, which will cause necessarily its annihilation. Start with that. You want a foreign policy that makes sense for America? Be good to America's friends and bad to America's enemies, wherever they are. If the friends are Israelis or Hondurans or Colombians or Japanese, whoever they are, just stand with America's allies, whether they're, even if they're authoritarian regimes, even if they're Egyptians, if they're fighting against enemies of America, then they're American allies. Stand with people who are fighting people who want to annihilate America. Share your values, don't share your values. They share your values of not being murdered by people who want to kill you. Stand with them. Oppose everybody else, including Turkey, a NATO member, including Qatar, which is the home of 3 very important U.S. military bases and, you know, a dozen U.S. universities. Oppose them. Oppose them. Because then people will want to be your allies and they won't want to be your friends. How are people of Ukraine feeling right now about that deal that they made with Clinton and giving up their nukes? Feeling good about it? If you don't stand with your allies, then nobody will want to be your ally. If you support your enemies, then everybody will want to be your enemy. Start with Israel. Be Israel's ally. Israel is America's ally. Be Israel's ally, and do it this way. There's no other way to truly be an ally of Israel except to reject the Palestinian propaganda myths about national rights to the Jewish heartland. Start there, and then things will start to fall into place, including language. So thank you guys
Carolyn,
very, very much.
Well done.
Thanks.
Let me just close by saying again, Carolyn, how much we prize you, both as a fellow at the center and as a colleague, and as really a binational treasure. We're very proud to be in your company and associated with you, and appreciate tremendously the clarity that you bring to all these things. I would like to just add one last point, if I may, and this conversation veered into another direction, which it would be useful to discuss maybe on another occasion, Matt, with you and others. But I did want to say that Michelle Bachmann yesterday introduced legislation, I believe it is 5914, did I get that right? I beg your pardon, transposed. 5194 is the bill number. I commend it to all of you. It would call for the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, foreign terrorist organization, and set in train a series of steps that would help counter it abroad and roll it up here. And it's a very, very important piece of legislation. If you are interested in learning more about it, I commend to you both her own office, of course, and one of our duty experts on the subject, Patrick Poole, and hope that all of your organizations and members and you as individuals will get behind this piece of legislation. It will go a ways towards helping with the kinds of problems that Carolyn's talked about so well. Thank you all for coming.
Wow. That was kind of fascinating, actually. Wow, I'm kind of speechless. That was great. Okay, so what I want to do is, as I think I promised earlier, was that I'm going to open up a hangout. If there's anybody who would like to come in and discuss what we've just heard, or like to add their own understanding of what we just heard, you're more than welcome to come in. But the only way I'm going to know if there's anyone out there who wants to come in is if I check the chat window. The YouTube chat window. Alright, let's go see what's happening in the YouTube chat window. not a damn thing. All right, so we don't need the YouTube chat window anymore, do we? This is actually part 2 of a running playlist. I will be continuing
An honor to introduce, to be introduced.
Soon, hopefully. I just wanted to cut this into a shorter section. Unfortunately, we're already at over 90 minutes, over an hour and a half, which I don't really like. I prefer to keep it to 1 hour for things like this, for most everything. Definitely under 2 hours, if possible. So, what we'll do is, we'll come back and continue as soon as we can. As soon as I can. I got to get caffeined up and stuff because it's still AM in this time zone. So please like and share and subscribe if you haven't already. And as per usual, I don't like to do this, but I do refer you to the donate button to my PayPal below. I think other than that, that's about it. I thank you again very much for watching. Spread the word. The one-state solution is the only solution. And subscribe if you haven't already. And as per usual, I don't like to do this, but I do refer you to the donate button to my PayPal below. I think other than that, that's about it. I thank you again very much for watching. Spread the word. The one-state solution is the only solution.